By the time the vote was called, the chamber had already decided what humanity was worth. The Hall of Nine Banners shimmered with cold light from the star well above, casting every delegate in silver except the lone human seated below the speaking tier, where observers, petitioners, and tolerated inconveniences were meant to sit. Earth had not been invited to defend its frontier claims as a full partner of the Meridian Accord. It had been summoned to watch them stripped away. Above that lowered platform, the emblems of the dominant worlds turned in slow ceremonial circles, beautiful and absolute, while the outer colonies that humans had bled to settle were reduced on the central display to colored sectors, shipping values, and exploitable routes. No one in the chamber raised their voice. That was what made it worse. The Carrid Trade Minister dismissed human patrol strength with a faint smile and 3 neat statistics. The Voss military chair called Earth's border fleets symbolic assets, and received a ripple of amusement from the upper arc. Another delegate, not even bothering to hide his boredom, suggested the contested systems would be safer under professional management. They did not speak like enemies preparing for war. They spoke like owners redistributing neglected property. Through it all, Envoy Leora Sato of Earth remained motionless in the low seat reserved for non-voting attendants, hands folded, expression unreadable, listening as if every insult were merely another number being entered into a ledger no one else knew existed. Then the vote passed. It should have been a routine theft wrapped in legal language, the kind empires commit so often they stop hearing the sound of their own teeth. The Accord recognized temporary custodial control over 6 human-administered frontier corridors, suspended Earth's emergency transit authority in the same regions, and transferred beacon maintenance to a coalition oversight board effective immediately. A few delegates leaned back in satisfaction. Others had already turned to side conversations, discussing mineral rights and revised toll structures before the formal record had even finished updating. Leora did not protest. She did not stand. She simply touched the slim black band at her wrist and said, in a tone so quiet the translation lattice almost failed to catch it, "Then let the record show that custody has changed." At first, nothing happened. And then every human beacon in known space went dark. The chamber's main display blinked once, then violently rearranged itself. Long chains of blue transit markers that had threaded the map for decades vanished in a single breath. Rescue relays disappeared with them. Hazard warnings, approach corrections, gravity drift compensators, refuel windows, customs routing ladders, silent emergency pathways through debris fields, gone. Shipping corridors did not explode, they dissolved. Freighters already in motion began dropping from clean navigation into raw probability. Insurance grids crashed across 4 sectors before anyone understood why. Somewhere beyond the chamber walls, alarms started wailing through the Accord's logistics spine as traffic control towers from 100 systems reported the same impossible thing. The routes were still there, but suddenly no one knew how to cross them safely. The laughter died so completely that Leora could hear fabric whisper when the Carrid minister rose too quickly from his seat. A military aide demanded a systems audit. Another ordered redundancy maps pulled from reserve archives, only to discover the reserves were incomplete because human auxiliaries had maintained the corrections no one else had bothered to catalog. On the star wall, entire trade arteries flickered from stable green to contested amber, then to blind gray. The chamber that had spent an hour measuring humanity's weakness now stared at a galaxy dimming around the shape of its absence. Only then did Leora stand. When every eye in the hall locked onto her, she looked not triumphant, not angry, but almost disappointed, as though the outcome had been predictable in the most exhausting way. "You mistook ownership for understanding," she said, and for the first time since the session began, there was something in her voice that made admirals forget their rank and ministers forget their rehearsed disdain. She glanced once at the dead map, once at the delegates who had just voted to take control of roads they did not know how to read, and then she asked the question that froze the room harder than the blackout itself. "Would you like to know," she said, "which systems fail next?" No one answered her at once, because the question was wrong in a way that made the whole chamber feel suddenly unstable. It was not the question of a cornered delegate trying to bargain for relevance. It was the question of someone standing inside the hidden architecture of the crisis while everyone else remained outside it, pressing their faces to the glass. Across the upper tiers, ministers barked orders into private channels, military attaches demanded route recovery protocols, and two separate trade blocs began accusing each other of sabotage before the first diagnostics had even returned. Yet beneath that rising noise, another realization moved faster than panic. The collapse had begun the exact second Earth's authority was transferred. Not an hour later, not after a retaliatory strike, not after a delay that could be explained away by technical lag. The systems had responded to the vote itself, as if humanity had built a tripwire into the legal fabric of the Accord and waited patiently for someone arrogant enough to step on it. The emergency overlays filled the air above the chamber in layers of red and gold, each new ribbon of data making the silence between delegates sharper instead of softer. Cargo queues were already backing up at major interchange worlds. Civilian traffic control hubs from the ocean belts to the Helix interior were reporting navigational uncertainty in lanes previously considered routine. Search and rescue networks had fallen into partial blindness. Because the gravitational correction markers on which they relied had been maintained through human auxiliary contracts so old and so unglamorous that no one on the oversight board had ever reviewed them twice. For years, the dominant species of the Accord had treated Earth like a useful but provincial workforce that handled the ugly edges of interstellar order. No one had imagined that the ugly edges were the structure. No one had asked what held the polished center in place. Leora did not raise her voice, and that restraint unsettled them more than fury would have. "The corridors you seized were never 6 pieces of territory," she said as the projection behind her continued to dim. "They were 6 junction authorities in a network you never mapped properly because you never believed the people maintaining it understood it better than you." The Voss military chair snapped back that Earth had no right to compromise civilian stability over a political dispute, but his outrage rang hollow even to his own aides. Everyone in the chamber had just watched the consequences of their vote arrive with surgical precision. This was not vandalism, and it was not temper. It was design. It carried the cold shape of something drafted long ago, signed quietly, and left waiting beneath the floorboards of the Accord until the day someone decided humanity could be dispossessed without consequence. Within minutes, the first casualty reports began arriving, and they were somehow worse for being small. A medical convoy carrying synthetic blood cultures for 3 plague wards had halted outside a dust-fractured corridor because its predictive drift model depended on human correction data no one else possessed in full. A passenger carrier diverted into a holding orbit above a refinery moon because its safe descent ladder had been built from layered route adjustments submitted over 20 years by human navigation teams whose recommendations had been archived as low-priority maintenance notes. A salvage flotilla in the Karen debris reach refused to move at all after its pilots learned the minefield ghosting tables they used were Earth-coded redundancies attached to a beacon authority now revoked by vote. Nothing was burning yet, and that almost made it crueler. The galaxy was discovering that collapse did not always begin with explosions. Sometimes it began with hesitation, then delay, then the terrible spreading knowledge that movement itself had become uncertain. High above the central floor, a junior systems analyst named Tal Ren forgot he was supposed to remain invisible. He served the Terran Directorate, one of the quieter powers of the Accord, and had been assigned to the summit precisely because nothing important was expected to happen. His task had been to audit tariff adjustments and frontier compliance summaries, the sort of bureaucratic work that brilliant people are given when their superiors mistake insight for inconvenience. But Tal had spent the last 3 years studying interspecies logistics failures, and the data now unfolding over the chamber made one thing immediately, sickeningly clear to him. Human networks had not failed. Human networks had withdrawn. There was a difference, and it was enormous. Failure was chaotic, asymmetrical, wasteful. This blackout was elegant. It severed access at the legal points of transfer and left untouched every neutral civic backbone the Accord still needed to avoid total catastrophe. Whoever designed it had not wanted mass death. They had wanted comprehension. That thought stayed with him when the session broke into emergency recess and the upper chambers erupted into private caucuses. Tal should have followed his minister, but instead he slipped into a records alcove and began pulling old infrastructure treaties faster than the archive could index them. At first the pattern looked absurd. Human signatures appeared everywhere no one prestigious liked to look, secondary repair clauses in old convoy agreements, emergency lane overrides in storm-heavy sectors, compensation waivers for volunteer beacon crews, modest access requests to derelict relay scaffolds, mineral-poor routes nobody wanted, maintenance jurisdiction over damaged systems too expensive for major powers to rebuild. It read like the paper trail of a species too humble to matter and too practical to admire. Yet when he overlaid those minor permissions against the blackout map, a hidden geometry emerged. Earth had spent decades occupying the neglected joints of interstellar civilization, the places no empire bragged about because no empire thought real power lived there. By the time Tal surfaced, the political mood in the hall had curdled from outrage into accusation. The Carrot trade bloc claimed Earth had concealed unlawful leverage inside coalition infrastructure. The Orcian representatives countered that the leverage had only become visible because the Accord had tried to confiscate sovereign transit authority without understanding the system attached to it. The Voss delegates wanted an immediate seizure of all human stations within military reach, but that proposal ran straight into a chilling practical question. Which stations were actually military, and which civilian systems would die with them if they were touched blindly? Every answer seemed to split into two worse answers behind it. Leora remained at the center of that unraveling not as the loudest figure in the room, but as the calmest. She accepted the emergency summons to remain under observation. She permitted her channels to be monitored. She even provided a partial list of humanitarian corridors that would remain stable for the next 12 hours if left undisturbed. It was, Tal realized, not mercy exactly. It was control performed so cleanly it could afford to resemble courtesy. Then came the first true fracture. A deep space convoy guild transmitted a collective protest to the Accord, demanding restoration of human technical personnel at once because independent routing teams had already failed to reproduce Earth's corrections in 3 separate lanes. This was followed by a message from the Rim Relief Coalition, a civilian alliance with no military weight but immense public sympathy, warning that entire famine mitigation schedules would slip if human relay logic remained offline. The chamber reacted as if struck. For generations, the great powers had spoken of humans as rough-edged newcomers living off peripheral labor and stubborn endurance. Now civilian networks, freight unions, rescue operators, and disaster coordinators were all saying the same humiliating thing in different words. The species treated as replaceable had been carrying more of the galaxy than anyone powerful had noticed. Tao returned to his console and opened a deeper archive branch, the sort reserved for obsolete filings and forgotten implementation notes. Buried beneath tariff appendices and decommissioned transit schedules, he found a series of human memoranda attached to infrastructure negotiations spanning 31 years. They all revolved around one recurring phrase, so understated it would have looked harmless to anyone reading quickly: continuity under treaty failure. Tal stared at the words for a long time while the emergency signals continued flashing red across the chamber walls. Earth had not merely prepared for mechanical breakdown or war. Earth had prepared for betrayal as a systems event. Not a battle. Not a bombing. A vote. A signature. A moment in which powerful people would look at something they did not understand and decide they owned it anyway. When he finally looked up, he realized the hall had gone quiet again. Leora Sato was no longer watching the dead map. She was watching him from across the chamber, as if she had known from the beginning that eventually someone young enough, ignored enough, and desperate enough would start reading the right documents in the right order. Her expression did not change, but she lifted one hand slightly toward the emergency display where the transit lattice of the Accord still flickered in partial blindness. Then, almost gently, she said, "You are still assuming this is the full withdrawal." And for the first time since the beacons went dark, Tal understood there might be something even worse than losing the routes humanity had built. There might be other systems no one had discovered yet. By the time the second emergency hour began, the Meridian Accord was no longer behaving like a government. It was behaving like a crowd trapped inside the shell of one, still dressed in ceremony, still speaking in procedural language, but thinking with the raw, directionless urgency of beings who had just discovered the ground beneath their hierarchy was borrowed. The Hall of Nine Banners remained open under emergency authority, yet almost no one was looking at the central charter display anymore. Their attention had shifted to the live transit matrix suspended above the chamber like a wounded constellation. Entire corridors continued to pulse in unstable amber, while others, older lanes, neglected lanes, frontier passages dismissed for decades as too inefficient to matter, remained strangely calm. That contrast cut deeper than the blackout itself. Humanity had not crippled everything. Humanity had chosen what to remove, what to leave, and what to let the powerful notice first. Tal Ren kept digging because he no longer trusted any summary generated by the Accord's main systems. Too many of those systems, he now realized, had been built to assume human cooperation as a permanent natural law, as fixed and thoughtless as gravity. He opened maintenance chains, customs harmonization logs, emergency beacon audit trails, and half-forgotten infrastructure appropriations that had been passed without debate because they sounded technical enough to bore the room into consent. The pattern was no longer subtle. Human engineers, route planners, and disaster analysts had spent 3 decades requesting stewardship over the exact kinds of systems prestigious species avoided: contingencies, redundancies, dead-end connectors, obsolete arrays, margin case navigation problems, failure bridges. Earth had not climbed to the center of power by competing for the throne. It had wrapped its hands around every support beam under the palace and waited for the day someone tried to kick it out of the building. What shook Tal more was how openly the evidence had been left in place. There were signatures, votes, committee remarks, casual dismissals preserved in clean legal formatting. Again and again, senior delegates had approved human oversight because the work looked menial. Again and again, they had congratulated themselves for saving money, offloading complexity, or integrating Terran persistence into low-value support frameworks. Tal found one particularly old committee note from a Voss administrator who had written, with chilling confidence, that humans possessed a useful tolerance for logistical drudgery and could be trusted with peripheral maintenance because peripheral maintenance did not shape strategic outcomes. He read that line 3 times. The document was 24 years old. Its assumption was dead. Its consequences were still spreading in real time through the arteries of half the galaxy. Across the chamber, Leora Sato had been escorted to a restricted consultation dais ringed by security that looked more ceremonial than protective. No one seemed certain whether she was a hostage, witness, negotiator, or the only adult left in the room. Delegates rotated through questioning cycles with increasing irritation and decreasing dignity. The Carad demanded immediate restoration of all human-controlled route systems under civilian necessity doctrine. Leora replied that those systems were operating under sovereign continuity conditions triggered lawfully by unlawful external custody transfer. The Voss accused Earth of coercion by infrastructural blackmail. Leora observed, without visible heat, that dependency revealed after a seizure attempt was not blackmail but diagnosis. Another minister tried to corner her by asking whether humanity had intended from the beginning to entangle the Accord in hidden reliance. She answered with a stillness that made the chamber lean toward her before it knew it was doing so. "No," she said. "We intended from the beginning to survive being underestimated." That line spread through the hall faster than any official directive. Tal heard it echoed in private channels, stripped of tone and context but gaining weight each time. Survive being underestimated. It did not sound like a threat. It sounded older than that, older and harder, the kind of principle a species might carve into itself before it ever reached the stars. For the first time, the crisis ceased to look like a political maneuver to Tal. It became something stranger and much larger. What if the blackout was not Earth lashing out after an insult? What if the insult had merely triggered the reveal of a civilization-scale reflex, something humanity had built because it assumed that sooner or later every empire with enough certainty would try exactly what the Accord had just done? The next data wave made the question uglier. 3 coalition recon flotillas had been dispatched toward the 6 frontier corridors placed under temporary custodial control by the vote. None reported enemy contact. None reported direct interference. But all 3 found navigation. Conditions deteriorating the deeper they traveled into regions formerly stabilized by Terran correction layers. Predictive route models began contradicting themselves. Beacon ghosts appeared where no active relay existed. Safe burn vectors drifted by fractions too small to matter once and too large to ignore now. One flotilla withdrew after a frigate skimmed a gravity seam that had not appeared on any standard survey. Another transmitted a formal protest claiming Earth had salted the corridors with deceptive route clutter. Yet when Tal examined the raw feed, the truth was more disturbing than sabotage. The space itself had not changed. The human overlays were gone. Everyone else was finally seeing how ugly those routes had always been without the quiet intelligence Earth had wrapped around them. A new set of messages arrived from human-administered outer colonies, and their tone damaged the room in an entirely different way. There was no panic in them, no emergency appeals, no desperate demand for military support after the Accord's vote had stripped their protections. Colonial administrations reported ration stability, route adaptations, medical continuity, and local confidence in previously modeled fallback conditions. Previously modeled. The phrase landed like a blade hidden inside harmless paper. These worlds had expected this. Not the exact vote, perhaps, but the category of event: political severance, transit destabilization, withdrawal of core guarantees. Someone had planned not just for the system's blackout, but for the emotional aftermath of abandonment. Tal felt the floor of his assumptions drop another level. Humans had not prepared a reaction. Humans had prepared a civilization to remain coherent while being cut loose. Then the first real panic struck the upper arc. Not because of a military report, but because of a market feed. Resource futures from the Helix interior collapsed in less than 4 minutes after analysts realized that several supposedly independent extraction belts relied on route synchronization software originally developed by Terran navigators under outsourced safety contracts. Insurance houses froze claims. Shipping consortiums began rerouting away from stable lanes simply because they no longer trusted the definitions of stable. The Accord's great powers had spent generations presenting themselves as architects of order while treating the hidden labor beneath that order as background noise. Now the background had stepped away, and the center was learning how much of its confidence had been borrowed from people it had never bothered to take seriously. Tal's search finally led him into an archive stratum so old the interface switched formats twice before loading. There, nested inside early Meridian standardization talks, he found a human briefing packet marked non-essential supplementary analysis. No one had opened it in 19 years. He almost didn't because the title sounded painfully dull: Distributed Continuity in Adversarial Political Environments. But once he began reading, the blood left his hands. The packet did not describe a military strategy. It described a species-level doctrine. It argued that any civilization entering a larger alliance while lacking visible parity in fleet mass or territorial leverage must assume that legal dispossession would one day be attempted under procedural cover. Therefore, survival depended on embedding indispensability beneath prestige thresholds, decentralizing critical knowledge into unglamorous custody zones, and ensuring that any hostile transfer of authority would trigger systemic asymmetry favoring the displaced party. The packet was older than some member states in the Accord. Humanity had drafted for betrayal before many current delegates had taken office. Tal looked up from the screen so abruptly that his chair rolled backward into the records wall. Around him, the hall had taken on the brittle atmosphere of a structure waiting for a second impact. Delegates were no longer arguing over whether Earth had overreacted. They were arguing over whether Earth had outplanned them by years or decades. Neither answer was survivable politically. He turned back to the document and reached the final appendix, expecting implementation theory, perhaps legal models, perhaps engineering notes. Instead he found a map key, partial, unfinished, and heavily abstracted, showing concentric layers of human-managed systems divided into categories the Accord had never officially recognized. Transit continuity, civilian resilience, peripheral autonomy, strategic opacity. Strategic opacity. Tal felt his pulse in his throat. The words were clinical, but the implication was monstrous. If transit beacons and rescue corrections belonged only to continuity, and colonial preparations belonged to resilience, Then what, exactly, had humanity placed inside the category marked opacity? What had they built that was never meant to be seen even in ordinary cooperation? He sent an encrypted request into the archive for cross-references, but before the system could return the first result, every remaining light in the hall dimmed at once. Gasps rippled upward. On the transit matrix above the chamber, a second layer of routes, ones Tal had never seen on any public accord chart, flared briefly into existence in cold white lines threading through dead sectors, military buffer zones, and supposedly unreachable void corridors. And then, just as suddenly, they vanished. For 3 stunned seconds after the white lattice vanished, no one in the hall seemed capable of movement, as though the chamber itself had briefly been shown the skeleton of a different galaxy and needed time to remember which reality it belonged to. Then the noise returned all at once. Military delegates rose half out of their seats, shouting for sensor captures, archive locks, and corridor confirmations. Trade ministers demanded to know whether the phantom routes had crossed commercial zones under charter protection. Security advisors began speaking over one another in 4 languages, each trying to be first to define what they had seen before someone else could own the interpretation. Yet beneath that scramble was a deeper injury, one far harder to hide. The Meridian Accord had just glimpsed a transportation layer beyond its maps, beyond its tariffs, beyond its border models, and the fact that it had appeared above the chamber without warning meant humanity had not merely built hidden infrastructure. Humanity had built hidden certainty. Tal Ren forced his hands back onto the console even though his fingers felt numb. Most of the chamber was staring upward in outrage or disbelief, but outrage would not preserve the data. He isolated the residual sensor echo from the transit matrix and pulled it into a private analysis buffer before the main military branches could classify it away from civilian review. The lines were already collapsing into noise, yet enough remained for one sickening conclusion. Those routes had not been random projections or software corruption. They intersected dead systems, collapsed mining corridors, treaty-neutral voids, and uninhabited drift pockets with a coherence no improvisation could produce. A hidden lattice existed, and it had existed long enough to mature into confidence. The blackout Earth had triggered was suddenly no longer the most dangerous fact in the room. The most dangerous fact was that the routes people knew were clearly not the only ones humans used. In the upper arc, the Voss military chair abandoned all pretense of legal patience. He demanded immediate seizure of every human logistics node, every colonial transfer port, every Terran ship within interception range. His voice cracked not from rage alone but from humiliation, because his earlier contempt now hung over him like a public sentence. Several delegates supported him at once, desperate for any proposal that sounded like action. Others recoiled, not out of principle but because the practical questions were multiplying faster than commands could answer them. What counted as a human logistics node if human influence had been threaded through neutral infrastructure for decades? Which colonial transfer ports were truly Terran, and which were shared systems whose disruption would starve allied worlds before Earth ever felt the pain? What fleet could even move quickly enough to enforce a seizure if the visible routes were failing and the invisible ones belonged to the people being targeted? The appetite for force was real. So was the terror of applying it blindly. Leora Sato watched the panic harden into factional fracture with the same contained attention she had shown during the original vote, but Tal noticed something new in her face now. Not triumph. Calculation. She was no longer waiting to see whether the chamber understood the lesson. She was evaluating how much of the lesson they could bear before someone made an irreversible decision out of wounded pride. When the Accord's presiding moderator tried to restore order by citing emergency deliberation protocol, Leora lifted one hand slightly, and the motion alone drew more obedience than the moderator's amplified authority. "Do not confuse invisibility with aggression," she said. "If we had wanted your corridors to burn, you would not be standing here debating procedure." It was not a boast, and that made it land harder. It sounded like a correction offered to children handling machinery they had not realized was live. Her restraint did not calm the room. It split it further. The Carrot bloc, whose merchant empires depended more than most on stable long-range routing, pivoted almost instantly from accusation to negotiation. Their representatives demanded partial technical restoration under escrow terms, offering temporary recognition of Earth's frontier stewardship while the broader dispute remained under review. The Orcian wanted a legal inquiry, hoping procedure might still contain what force could not. The Voss interpreted both as weakness bordering on treason and began transmitting quiet mobilization orders toward two human-adjacent sectors anyway. Tau saw the encrypted flags ripple through shared command traffic. Someone at the top still believed this crisis could be bullied back into familiar shape. Then the first sealed packets arrived. They appeared not on public displays but in restricted channels belonging to high-ranking officers, strategic ministers, and infrastructure governors across 6 member powers. Security teams swore the transmissions had bypassed conventional insertion points. No code breach could be identified. No source chain could be reconstructed. At first the recipients refused to acknowledge them. Then one Voss admiral went pale enough that even the distant tiers could see it and abruptly terminated all outbound orders from his command thread. A Carad minister stood so fast his chair overturned behind him. Another delegate demanded a chamber lockdown, which only made everyone else understand that whatever was in those packets was worse than the hidden routes alone. Tal did not receive one. He only saw their effects. A communications aide whispered into the ear of the Terran minister, who turned and stared at Leora with a look that was not hatred and not fear but the terrible dawning recognition that privacy itself might have become a historical concept. Moments later, fragments began leaking through secondary chatter. Fuel reserve placements. Evacuation timings for civilian dependents. Unpublicized vulnerabilities in orbital dry docks. Maintenance windows for defensive arrays. Not threats. Not demands. Just correct information arranged in a way that made one truth impossible to escape. Humanity could see the Accord's nervous system with an intimacy none of its own member powers possessed. The sealed packets had done what fleets and speeches often failed to do. They had made command feel naked. For the first time since the blackout, Tal understood why the hidden route lattice had only flashed into view for an instant. It had not been exposed by accident. Humanity was pacing the revelation, showing enough to collapse old assumptions, withholding enough to let fear do the remaining engineering. The strategy was brutal in its elegance. Give the powerful evidence that they have misunderstood the structure around them. Give them proof that the misunderstanding extends into domains they consider private, sovereign, untouchable. Then force them to imagine the layers still unseen. The mind, once cornered by uncertainty at scale, becomes a more efficient weapon against itself than any invading fleet. He returned to the archival packet on adversarial continuity and reopened the appendix beneath strategic opacity, searching now with a narrower, more desperate intelligence. Buried in a subnote cross-linked to early colonial governance doctrine, he found a line so restrained it almost vanished under its own bureaucratic language. Resilience is visible when tested. Opacity is only useful if discovery occurs after dependency has matured. Tal stared at the sentence until its shape became unbearable. Humanity had not hidden its leverage because secrecy was elegant. It had hidden its leverage because premature discovery would have invited dismantling before the network became indispensable. The whole doctrine was built around time, patience, and insult absorbed without reaction until invisibility turned from vulnerability into armor. Below the chamber, messages were now pouring in from frontier worlds the Accord had just claimed to place under custodial stabilization. The governors of those worlds were refusing coalition oversight landings. Not violently, not rebelliously, calmly. Their statements were nearly identical in spirit though different in language, as if drafted from principles rather than scripts. Local continuity remains in effect. Civil administration is stable. External intervention is unnecessary and may compromise protected systems. Protected systems. Another phrase no one in the hall liked the sound of. It suggested those colonies were not frightened, not abandoned, and not improvising. They were executing preparation. The Voss bloc, cornered by its own embarrassment, made the choice Tal had begun to fear from the moment the hidden lattice vanished. Their chair rose, ignored half the chamber's protests, and announced that an expeditionary command had already been authorized to enter one of the seized frontier corridors and establish physical verification of all Terran infrastructure present. It was a desperate attempt to reclaim reality through presence, to plant ships where certainty had been lost and force the universe to feel solid again. Gasps and shouted objections followed from every tier, some legal, some moral, many simply terrified of what such an incursion might trigger. Through it all, Leora Sato did not move. She looked at the man as one might look at a patient reaching for the knife the surgeon had explicitly asked him not to touch. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost gentle. "The route you've chosen," she said, "has not belonged to your maps for 18 years. And somewhere far beyond the Hall of Nine Banners, a Voss fleet had already jumped." The hall did not erupt when she said it. Eruption would have implied energy, and what fell across the chamber was colder than that. It was the vacuum that follows a sentence too precise to dismiss and too late to undo. The Voss military chair opened his mouth as if authority alone might still reverse what had been launched under his command, but even before his aides thrust new telemetry into his hands, the delegates around him had begun to understand the real damage. This was no longer a political crisis contained to votes, corridors, and diplomatic leverage. A fleet had just entered terrain the humans had described, not theatrically, not symbolically, but with the dead factual certainty of ownership. In that instant, the Meridian Accord stopped being the institution that judged Earth and became the institution waiting to learn how much of reality it had been renting from people it had mocked. The first reports from the incursion arrived in fragments, not because anyone was censoring them, but because the officers sending them no longer agreed on what they were looking at. The Voss lead cruiser exited transit cleanly, registered no hostile contacts, and confirmed the corridor appeared navigable for a narrow band of approach. 40 seconds later, its support destroyers reported divergence in beacon alignment despite holding identical vector locks. A survey frigate then transmitted that the starfield itself appeared offset, not physically impossible, but subtly wrong in a way no bridge crew could instantly trust. 9 seconds after that, half the formation began receiving emergency route advisories authenticated with old Meridian security keys, each directive warning of a different catastrophic path ahead. One captain obeyed. Another rejected the alert as spoofing. A third held course. By the time command tried to reassert formation discipline, the fleet no longer shared a common picture of space. Tal Ren watched the feed in sick disbelief as the tactical map split into layered uncertainties. No hostile ships appeared. No weapons fire registered. There was only corridor logic turning against the assumptions of those inside it. One destroyer vanished from formation after following what seemed to be the safest correction arc. It did not explode. It simply ceased returning synchronized coordinates. Another ship cut power to stabilize drift and found itself trapped between conflicting gravitic predictions generated from two equally valid route models. Then the lead cruiser transmitted a message so stripped of military pride it sounded almost civilian. "We do not know which instruments still belong to us." That was the sentence that hollowed the hull. Fleets were built on force, but force without trust in position, distance, timing, and sequence was only mass waiting for catastrophe. Leora did not look at the tactical display while the delegates stared at their unraveling certainty. She was watching them instead, and Tal understood why. The Voss fleet was not the true audience of what was happening out there. The chamber was. Humanity was not proving it could kill. Humanity was proving it could define the meaning of movement itself inside spaces everyone else believed were neutral. That distinction mattered more than any battle would have. Battles produced martyrs, outrage, excuses. This produced comprehension. It was surgical, humiliating, and impossible to call barbaric because the humans still had not fired a single shot. Then the twist beneath the twist emerged. A broad-spectrum transmission entered the hull under old emergency civil authority tags, overriding military priority by legal precedent no one had bothered revisiting in decades. The source identifier read as a human disaster management channel, the kind of low-prestige network delegates once muted during summit hours because it usually carried evacuation drills, storm advisories, famine mitigation schedules, and refugee routing requests. The chamber almost laughed at the absurdity of it, almost, until the message resolved into a full corridor simulation built from real-time feeds inside the VOS incursion zone. Thousands of variables moved across the display in calm, layered precision. Drift wells, echo relays, abandoned mining shear points, legacy pathing scars, ghost beacons from earlier wars, emergency anchor points, recovery shells. Not one of them new, not one of them illegal. The simulation did not reveal a trap humanity had sprung. It revealed a space humanity had understood, maintained, and quietly civilized while others flew over it with imperial confidence and administrative ignorance. A voice followed, not Leora's, not military, and somehow more devastating because of its utter normalcy. It belonged to a middle-aged human systems architect speaking from an operations deck somewhere outside known Accord grids. Her tone was steady, almost instructional, the tone of someone explaining to stressed civilians why a bridge had to close before it collapsed. She identified herself as Director Mara Vale, Continuity Command, Outer Network. No threat. No greeting. No drama. She informed the hall that the VOS task force was presently alive, structurally intact, and moving through an unmanaged corridor layer that Earth had stabilized incrementally over 22 years under auxiliary maintenance authorities, salvage permissions, humanitarian routing exceptions, and derelict access grants approved by Meridian institutions that had never once classified the work as strategic. She explained that if human guidance was withheld, projected fleet survival dropped sharply with each attempted course correction. Then she added, with almost unbearable restraint, "We can return them safely if the Accord is prepared to listen before it commands." The chamber broke not in volume, but in hierarchy. Admirals who had sneered at Earth's frontier capacity were suddenly being briefed by a human continuity director whose title none of them had ever considered important enough to learn. Ministers who built their reputations on visible power now sat beneath a systems map showing that decades of human labor had reached farther into the structure of civilization than their fleets ever had. For the first time, Tal saw the real shape of Earth's answer. Humanity had never tried to win by surpassing the Meridian Accord on the terms the great powers respected most. That would have required public parity, more ships, bigger shipyards, louder deterrence, more obvious ambition. Instead, humans had chosen the one path empires never defend against until too late: indispensability hidden inside service. The revelations spread outward in pieces so simple they became horrifying. Human support contracts had not been secondary work, they had been long-term custody over the seams between systems. Human relief ships had not been goodwill theater, they had been reconnaissance wrapped in compassion, learning how populations moved when formal infrastructure failed. Human salvage teams had not merely recovered wrecks, they had mapped dead zones, unstable corridors, and forgotten transitions that no military database maintained because no military planner expected to need them until defeat. Human colonists on neglected worlds had not simply survived hardship better than expected, they had become nodes in a distributed fallback civilization built to remain coherent if central treaties turned hostile. The species everyone called rugged, improvised, and provincial had in fact been patient at a scale the Accord could barely emotionally process. Tal felt something shift inside him then, something deeper than fear and sharper than admiration. He had spent his career studying systems from above, believing power could be understood by tracing budgets, fleet allocations, trade law, and institutional command. Humanity had approached the same galaxy from below. They had studied not how power announced itself, but how it failed, how it cracked, where it forgot to look, and who was expected to keep things working after the important people left the room. The brilliance of it was almost offensive in retrospect. Earth had allowed itself to be catalogued as a minor power because major powers monitored rivals, not servants. They tracked threats, not maintainers. They respected visible engines and ignored hidden load-bearing walls. Humanity had stepped into that contempt and worn it like camouflage. Mara Vale's simulation rotated, and the VOS task force reappeared inside a broader route model. Tal saw then that the hidden white lattice from earlier had not represented an invasion network massing for war. It had represented something arguably more shocking. A civilization-scale exit architecture. Parallel routes. Independent logistics. redundant corridors beyond coalition choke points, refuge chains, industrial migration lanes. Humanity had not disappeared because it was cornered. Humanity had disappeared because it was proving it could leave the Accord's grasp and remain fully alive beyond it. That truth struck the hull harder than any show of force could have done. An enemy can be fought. A dependency can be renegotiated. But a species that can walk away from the center while the center cannot function without it, that species rewrites the meaning of power. Leora Sato finally looked up at the delegates, and there was no anger in her face now, only a weary kind of clarity, as though this moment had cost humanity too many quiet years to waste on bitterness. "You thought we built for war," she said. "We built for abandonment." Her eyes moved once to the tactical display, where the trapped Voss fleet waited between ruin and rescue. "The question before you is no longer whether Earth can be removed from your system. You have already answered that. The question is whether your system survives being removed from us." And before anyone in the hall could decide whether pride, fear, or need should speak first, a second transmission arrived from beyond the mapped frontier, this one carrying the registry signatures of hundreds of human convoy groups the Accord had never known existed. The convoy registry signatures rolled across the central display in discipline columns, each one stamped with human identifiers the Meridian Accord's databases recognized only in fragments, as though the official record had spent decades glimpsing shadows of a structure it never believed deserved full attention. Ore tenders, hospital carriers, fabrication hulks, fuel trains, mobile foundries, archive barges, agricultural vault ships, cryogenic transport lattices, escort groups coded under colonial defense exemptions, and long-haul engineering vessels once classified as support traffic all streamed into view in numbers that made the chamber's silence feel crowded. This was not a hidden armada in the shape the great powers would have expected. It was something far harder for them to process. It was a whole civilization in motion. Not fleeing. Not scattering. Relocating with the calm coherence of a species that had rehearsed leaving long before anyone forced it to prove it could. For a few seconds, even the Voss delegates forgot their trapped task force. The scale of the convoy signatures dwarfed the political crisis that had triggered them. These were not emergency evacuations assembled in panic after the vote. Their timing, spacing, and lane synchronization were too clean, too balanced across supply classes and escort intervals. Human industrial continuity had shifted out of the Accord's visible center without broadcasting distress and without disrupting its own internal order. The implications spread across the hall with the chilling smoothness of poison in water. While the Meridian powers had been busy ranking Earth by public fleet tonnage, treaty prominence, and visible territorial authority, humanity had been building a second circulatory system outside those measurements. They had not merely prepared to endure exclusion. They had prepared to outgrow the need for inclusion. Messages began landing from across the Accord in numbers that overwhelmed prioritization. Governors from dense interior worlds reported food synthesis delays after cargo timing algorithms failed without Terran route logic to absorb corridor drift. Emergency response coordinators from storm-prone systems warned that evacuation throughput had already fallen below safe thresholds because human redundancy maps were no longer being updated in shared civic layers. Frontier patrols complained that pirate clusters, dormant for years under stable logistics pressure, were suddenly reappearing where response times had lengthened. Insurance markets entered controlled freeze. Commodity exchanges halted without agreement. Passenger traffic caps were imposed on 6 major routes after NAV authorities admitted privately that they no longer trusted their own risk windows. Nothing was collapsing in flames, but everything was tightening, every minute another knot drawn in a structure too large to scream all at once. Tal Ren watched the broader pattern converge and felt the horror deepen precisely because the crisis remained so administratively legible. This was not cinematic ruin, not yet. It was civilization learning that normality had load-bearing assumptions attached to it and that one of those assumptions had just exercised the right to leave. The Meridian Accord had always pictured power as the capacity to project force outward, to secure borders, dominate trade, and compel obedience through visible superiority. Humanity had answered with another model entirely. Real power, they had decided, was the capacity to preserve continuity when trust failed. It was the ability to keep one's people fed, moved, hidden, coordinated, and recoverable after the center turned hostile. That kind of power did not need to roar. It only needed to remain intact while everything louder started asking where its foundation had gone. The hardliner blocks refused to yield gracefully. Pride, once threatened, rarely does. Even with the Voss incursion force trapped and dependent on human guidance for safe return, 3 military coalitions opened urgent backchannel discussions about synchronized strikes against human colonies close enough to reach through stable lanes still under non-Terran supervision. Tal intercepted pieces of the traffic and almost could not believe the desperation embedded in its logic. The argument was simple and catastrophic. If humanity's true strength lay in distributed systems rather than visible fleets, then pressure had to be applied directly to the human population centers anchoring those systems before Earth completed its withdrawal. It was the reasoning of rulers who still believed force could restore psychological ownership of a crisis they no longer understood. And because the chamber was full of beings whose careers had been built on that belief, the argument found listeners. Leora heard the shift before most of them did. Tal could tell from the way her attention sharpened, not on the loudest speakers, but on the aides leaning close, the quiet exchange of sealed notes, the small convulsions of decision that happen at the edges of formal debate before orders become public. She stepped toward the central field for the first time since the blackout, and the room changed around her. The delegates did not stop speaking because she demanded silence. They stopped because somewhere below anger, below fear, they had begun to recognize an older danger, that humanity might still be offering restraint they had not earned. If you send forces toward our colonies now, she said, you will not be escalating this dispute. You will be teaching my government that our peaceful assumptions were optimistic. The sentence landed with an almost unbearable softness. No threat posture. No rhetorical flourish. Just a line drawn so cleanly it made every reckless thought in the room suddenly visible. It should have been enough. It was not. The first unsanctioned strike launched less than 9 minutes later. It did not come from the Voss, whose humiliation had at least taught them caution. It came from a secondary compact whose leadership had spent generations resenting human resilience precisely because it refused to fit the social hierarchy of the Accord. Their fleet was smaller, faster, and arrogant in a new way, the arrogance of people convinced that if they acted before consensus formed, they could seize the one decisive move history would later reward. They targeted a human colony cluster near the Ashfall Verge, a set of austere worlds long dismissed as marginal because they produced little luxury output and requested almost no central investment. The Compact's admirals assumed, with fatal confidence, that such a peripheral region could not possibly matter enough to be heavily shielded. That assumption lasted until their jump signatures crossed into local space and every tactical board in the hall began flooding with returns that made trained officers go still. There was no fleet waiting for them. There were stations and they were old. There were anchor platforms, weathered and unadorned, orbiting in patterns so mundane no military intelligence report had ever classified them as more than colonial industrial scaffolds. There were mass relays shaped like freight rings. Habitat spokes, ice hauler docks, salvage yards, agricultural spindle arrays. All the infrastructure that powerful species learn to stop seeing because it looks like labor rather than threat. Then, one by one, the civilian structures lit with coordinated precision. Route shutters unfolded from inside refinery shells. Thermal baffles dropped from cargo lattices to reveal layered sensor webs. Tractor bands synchronized across 6 moons. Defensive geometry blossomed out of the colony's working body like a skeleton stepping through skin. The Ashfall Verge was not defended by a military perimeter bolted around ordinary life. Ordinary life had been built as defense from the beginning. Gasps tore through the hall as the strike fleet's formation destabilized without a shot being fired. Its lead corvettes found their burn vectors dragged sideways by industrial gravlifts repurposed into corridor shear. Missile locks dissolved in clouds of reflective or chaff expelled from harvest rails. Approach windows folded shut as freight rings rotated into overlapping interference arcs that broke targeting solutions apart into nonsense. Human escorts still did not appear, and that absence became more terrifying by the second. The colony itself was fighting, not through hidden warships, but through the intelligence embedded in its structure, through systems designed years ago by people the Meridian Accord had never bothered to rank as strategists because they wore the wrong titles and built the wrong-looking things. Then Mara Vale's voice returned over the emergency field, cooler now, stripped even of the gentleness she had offered before. "You are seeing," she said, "what happens when a people expect rescue to arrive too late." The compact fleet tried to withdraw. That was when the final twist of the engagement revealed itself. The route behind them was gone. Not destroyed, not mined, not interdicted by human fire. Simply gone from navigable confidence, shuttered by a mesh of local corrections and dead-angle pathing only the colony understood. They had entered assuming they were raiding a margin. They now hung in space before an unimportant world that had just demonstrated it could trap armed ships with infrastructure everyone had mistaken for provincial necessity. Across the hall, ministers who had still been clinging to fantasies of punitive action felt those fantasies begin to die. If even the forgotten human worlds were built like this, then what in the name of every arrogant empire's blind spot had Earth been constructing in the places that actually mattered? Tal's console chimed with a new feed priority override. He opened it and felt his throat close. The trapped Voss task force, still alive in the unmanaged corridor, had received external contact at last. Not from a warfleet. From something the registry identified only as Terran Retrieval Group 7. And the tonnage reading was wrong by an order of magnitude. The tonnage reading did not make sense at first because it refused to fit any category the Meridian Accord used to define power. It was too large to be a standard escort formation, too evenly distributed to be a concentrated warfleet, and too structurally irregular to match any industrial convoy Tal had ever studied. Yet as the feed stabilized, the truth forced its way through classification systems that had never been built to recognize it. Retrieval Group 7 was not a fleet in the way the Accord understood fleets. It was an ecosystem of vessels, modules, mobile structures, and autonomous support bodies moving in perfect cohesion, each element carrying a function that blurred the line between civilian necessity and strategic dominance. Repair lattices folded alongside armored transit shells. Medical platforms nested within reinforced cargo spines. Fabrication arrays rotated in tandem with navigation cores. It was not designed to destroy. It was designed to endure, adapt, and decide what survived in its presence. The Voss task force, scattered and disoriented inside the unmanaged corridor, reacted with instinctive military caution. Targeting systems tried to resolve threat vectors. Defensive grids cycled. Communication hails were transmitted, first formal, then urgent. Retrieval Group 7 did not respond in kind. It did not threaten. It did not posture. It simply entered the corridor and began stabilizing it. Tal watched in stunned silence as drifting route predictions snapped back into coherence wherever the human formation passed. Ghost signals collapsed. Conflicting vectors aligned. The chaos that had trapped the Voss fleet began unwinding not because it was being defeated, but because it was being understood. Humanity was not just capable of operating in these invisible layers. Humanity could rewrite them in real time. Across the hall, something broke that no procedural recovery could repair. Admirals who had built their reputations on mastering combat doctrine were now witnessing a form of dominance that rendered combat irrelevant. Ministers who had spent decades negotiating trade advantages saw, with a clarity that cut deeper than humiliation, that trade itself had always depended on a stability they had not controlled. Even the most rigid ideologues in the chamber could no longer pretend this was a contest of fleets or treaties. This was a confrontation between two definitions of power, and one of them had just demonstrated it could function without the other. The Voss flagship transmitted again, this time abandoning formal structure entirely. "Requesting guidance," the captain said, the words carrying through the hall with a weight that settled over every delegate. Guidance. Not orders. Not negotiations. Guidance from the very species their command had attempted to challenge minutes earlier. The response came not from Leora, not from the hall, but from Mara Vale. Her voice threaded through the channel with the same steady control that had guided every revelation so far. "Hold position," she said. You will be extracted. There was no delay, no deliberation. Retrieval Group 7 moved with quiet inevitability. Structural segments unfolded and repositioned around the stranded ships, not enclosing them as captives, but stabilizing the corridor space they occupied. Route anchors reformed. Drift collapsed into alignment. The Voss fleet, which had entered with weapons primed and confidence intact, now hung inside a human-defined reality that treated them not as enemies, but as variables to be preserved or discarded at will. Tal realized then that the greatest shock was not what humanity could do. It was what humanity was choosing not to do. The Accord had humiliated Earth, attempted to seize its territory, launched a reckless incursion, and initiated an unsanctioned strike against its colonies. At every stage, humanity had possessed the leverage to retaliate decisively, to crush fleets, to fracture economies, to carve its superiority into the memory of every species present. And yet it had not. Every action so far had been measured, restrained, almost surgical in its refusal to escalate into destruction. That restraint now became the most terrifying element in the entire equation. It meant this was not the limit of human capability. It was the limit of human intention. In the chamber, the factions that had once driven the crisis began collapsing under the weight of that realization. The Carrot bloc abandoned its bargaining posture entirely and issued a full emergency appeal for cooperative restoration, offering immediate recognition of Terran sovereignty across all disputed corridors. The Orcian demanded a formal suspension of all aggressive actions pending structural review. Even within the Voss ranks, voices shifted from defiance to survival. The idea of forcing humanity into submission had not just failed. It had inverted, revealing the Accord itself as the dependent party. Only one question remained, and it spread through the hall not as a formal motion, but as a shared understanding that no one could avoid. If humanity could leave, if humanity could survive independently, if humanity could choose to help or not help with absolute control over the systems that sustain the galaxy, then why would it stay? Leora Sato stepped forward once more, not as an observer, not as a tolerated inconvenience, but as the axis around which the entire chamber now turned. She did not raise her voice because she no longer needed to. "You have seen enough," she said. "Not everything. Enough." Her gaze moved across the delegates, holding them one by one in a silence that demanded honesty where arrogance had once lived. The Meridian Accord believed it was the center of civilization. What you are feeling now is what happens when the center discovers it was part of a system it did not build. No one interrupted her. No one dared. "We did not disappear to punish you," she continued. "We disappeared to remove ourselves from your assumptions. You believed we needed your recognition to matter. You believed we needed your protection to survive. You believed you could redefine our place without consequence because you thought you understood the structure we stood inside." Her eyes flicked briefly to the display where Retrieval Group 7 continued its quiet work, guiding the Voss fleet out of a reality it had never been meant to enter unprepared. "You were wrong." The words settled into the chamber like gravity. "And now," she said, softer still, "you must decide something far more difficult than how to defeat us." Tal felt the weight of what was coming before she finished the sentence. "You must decide," Leora said, "whether you deserve to exist inside what we have built." The chamber did not respond. Because for the first time in its history, the Meridian Accord was not facing an enemy, a rival, or a negotiation. It was facing judgment. The silence that followed did not feel like hesitation. It felt like a boundary, as if the Meridian Accord had reached the edge of a reality it could no longer define by vote, force, or precedent. No one called for order because order, as they had known it, had been exposed as something conditional. The chamber that had once measured power in fleets and votes now sat inside a moment where neither could compel the outcome. Across the central display, Retrieval Group 7 completed its final alignment, and one by one, the Voss ships slipped back into stable transit, not conquered, not damaged, simply returned. The gesture landed harder than destruction ever could have. Humanity had taken a fleet that entered in arrogance, stripped it of certainty, shown it the limits of its understanding, and then chosen to give it back. Tal Ren watched the last signal from the recovered formation fade into the wider traffic grid and felt something settle into place inside him, something that would not leave. This was the answer he had been searching for since the first beacon went dark. Not how powerful humanity was. Why it had revealed that power this way. Every step of the crisis had been structured not to break the accord, but to force it to see itself clearly. The humiliation at the summit, the blackout, the hidden lattice, the trapped fleet, the colony that defended itself through its own existence, the retrieval that restored what could have been erased, all of it had been a sequence, not of attacks but of lessons. And the final lesson was not being delivered through words. It was being delivered through restraint. Leora Sato did not rush the moment. She allowed the weight of what had just occurred to settle fully into every delegate, every advisor, every observer who would carry this memory back to their worlds. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried no trace of triumph. "We will restore the network," she said. The sentence was simple, but it reshaped the room instantly. Not a demand. Not a bargain. A decision. Not because the Accord has asked. Not because the Accord has authority. Because the people who depend on it deserve continuity. A murmur moved through the chamber, softer than before, threaded with something unfamiliar. Not relief. Not yet. Something closer to shame. She stepped closer to the central platform, closing the distance that had once symbolized humanity's exclusion. "But it will not be restored as it was," she continued. "You will not return to a system where power is defined by visibility alone, where those who maintain the structure are treated as expendable, where resilience is mistaken for weakness." Her gaze moved across the upper arc, and Tao saw something in the faces of the most powerful delegates that had not been there before. They were listening not as authorities, but as participants in a system they had only just begun to understand. The proposal appeared on the central display without flourish. It did not resemble a list of demands. It resembled architecture. Distributed governance of transit systems. Shared custody of continuity networks. Legal recognition of infrastructural sovereignty across all member species, not just those with military parity. Mandatory redundancy oversight councils composed not of admirals and ministers, but of engineers, logisticians, and systems architects. Safeguards that prevented any single power from controlling the conditions under which others could move, survive, or recover. It was, Tao realized, not a victory document. It was a correction. A redefinition of what the Accord had always claimed to be but had never truly practiced. No one laughed this time. The vote, when it came, did not carry the arrogance of the one that had started the crisis. It carried weight. One by one, the banners above the chamber shifted, each species casting its decision not into a system it controlled, but into one it now understood it depended on. The result was not unanimous, but it did not need to be. The threshold was met, and with it, something older than any treaty in the hall shifted. Humanity was no longer being measured against the Accord. The Accord was being measured against humanity's definition of survival. Outside the chamber, across the vast spread of systems that had held their breath through uncertainty, the change began quietly. Human beacons returned, not all at once, but in deliberate sequence. Corridors stabilized. Drift corrections reappeared. Rescue nets resumed their silent watch. Trade routes reopened, not as they had been, but as something stronger, more balanced, less fragile in the places that had once been ignored. The galaxy did not cheer. It exhaled. Tao remained where he stood long after the session ended, watching the network rebuild itself in real time. He understood now that the most important thing humanity had demonstrated was not that it could leave, or that it could control the unseen layers of civilization. It was that it had chosen to return after proving it did not need to. That choice echoed louder than any display of force. It redefined trust, not as something granted by authority, but as something earned through understanding and maintained through respect. At the far end of the chamber, Leora Sato paused before exiting, her hand resting briefly against the structure that had once placed her below the others. For a moment, Tao wondered what she saw when she looked at it now. Not the insult it had been. Not the victory it had become. Something else. Something quieter. Then she stepped away, and the distance between her and the center no longer meant what it once had. The meridian accord would continue. The routes would flow. The systems would hold. But no one who had been in that chamber would ever again believe that power was what you could count. And somewhere, beyond the restored corridors and the visible order they supported, the deeper human networks remained, unmapped, patient, and unseen, waiting for the next time someone decided to measure them incorrectly.